Welcome to Thinking Green. I am Rana, and today is May 1st, which throughout the world, except here, is May Day, which is a huge workers' holiday. The years I lived in Israel, May Day was really a cause for celebration and action, and we haven't really much heard about it here, but not really coincidentally, but fortuitously, our guest tonight is attorney Peter Goselin, and he is seeking the Green Party nomination for Attorney General for this year. Our nominating convention is in a couple of weeks, and I anticipate he'll be nominated, but we're going to talk about legal issues, what an Attorney General does, and lots of other related things. So welcome, Peter.
Well, thank you.
So tell me about May Day. I mean, I lived out of the country, so I experienced it a little bit, but what happened to the United States?
Well, certainly from the end of World War II up until, I'd say maybe about 11 years ago, May Day was not only something that wasn't being celebrated, frankly, it was dangerous to celebrate it in the United States. From the time of the end of the war, certainly through the 60s, it was the sort of thing that would bring people to bash your heads in, or get you blacklisted from your job, or get you thrown out of the college that you were attending or where you taught. And then there was a long period during which it was simply everybody knew that everyone else in the world celebrated Labor Day on May 1st, and the United States didn't. But the real turning point in recent years was that in 2006, there was a wave, and really unprecedented wave of protests and people walking off the job and going on strike, focusing on immigrant rights. There were somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.5 million people participated in walkouts that day. People, primarily Latinos, but certainly not exclusively, but immigrants all over the United States said, you know what, you need to hear from us about the way that your immigration laws are preventing us from being able to live as American citizens. And from that period, that was really kind of a turning point. From that period on, May Day celebrations have become a lot more common. I just came from the May Day celebration in New Haven, which was great. New Haven has actually, to its credit, had May Day for many years. But there's no question that a big focus now is the struggle around immigrant rights and the struggle around international workers' rights.
And we're still behind. I know I was a preschool teacher before I retired, and the wages, as I'm sure you know, are just poverty level throughout the field. And one year, a friend and I tried to get centers like a year ahead of time to close on May 1st so we could go to Hartford for our Worthy Wage Day. And there were only about 2 child care centers in the whole state that when they put together their yearly calendar would make May 1st a day off. So even like people working within the field, the administrators of those programs just really weren't supportive of the idea.
Sure.
So your legal practice has focused a lot on immigrant rights and worker rights. So tell me about what issues you deal with and what kind of things you see.
Well, probably, since with that introduction, probably the first thing I should say is that I'm not an immigration lawyer, because frankly, every time I talk about immigrant rights, I almost immediately afterwards get calls from people about immigration law, and that happens not to be what I do. I'm a labor and employment lawyer, and but one of the areas of focus, over the years, I've done a tremendous amount of work around anti-discrimination cases, sexual harassment, things like that. But about 10 or 12 years ago, I started handling cases that were essentially what we characterize now as wage theft cases, cases where an employer has made an agreement with the employee that they're going to compensate them in a certain fashion for their work, and then either either that agreement is illegal because the wages that are being paid are lower than the law requires, or just as often, whether the amount is correct or not, come payday or come the completion of the job or whatever, the employee goes to the employer and says, okay, where's my pay? And the employer says, go pound sand. And of course, one of the reasons that they do that is that when folks who are looking for their wages are either undocumented immigrants or are perceived to be undocumented immigrants, the employer feels that they can simply flout the laws with impunity, and almost always the refusal to pay wages is accompanied by a threat. I'm not going to pay you, and if you keep on insisting that I pay you, I'm going to call ICE or I'm going to call the police and I'm going to get you deported. So these are really employers who rely on the threat of our really terrible immigration laws in order to be able to get away with stealing from people, get away with stealing the wages that people have earned.
So what kind of recourse do immigrants have in this case, in a case like this?
Well, the interesting thing about it is that there are certain areas of law, and employment laws, some areas of employment law certainly are among them, where what rights you have do not depend on whether you are an immigrant or whether you're here in the country legally. Incidentally, the same is true for most of the rights under the Constitution: the right to free speech, free press, freedom of assembly.
Yeah,
those are not given.
Yeah, state is only for U.S. citizens.
Right,
if you
exactly.
read the Constitution.
Right. The government can't take away the rights of any person to speak freely, or to publish a newspaper, or to have a television show, or to do any of these other things that involve, our constitutional rights. But also in the area of labor and employment law, when somebody has performed work, the law says you have to pay them. And you have to pay them according to the standards that apply to everyone. And there are no exceptions. And that law applies just as much to people who are here undocumented as to people on green cards or people who are citizens, people who came over on the whose ancestors came over to the Mayflower. It makes no difference at all. And so, when I get involved in these cases, very often it's an eye-opening and educational experience for the employer, because they've been operating on the assumption that it's okay to steal from these people, that it's okay to cheat them. And they're surprised when they find out that the law actually doesn't allow them to do that.
And I'm guessing that some of the employees, before they've come to you, also don't know, because I'm guessing there are some who never get to a lawyer. They just suck it up and take it.
Yeah, the number of people the number of people who bring claims with private lawyers like me, and the number of people who use maybe a legal aid organization, and the number of people who go and complain directly to the Department of Labor, it can't be more than a tenth of all of the people who are being cheated out of wages. The great majority of people, many of them don't know their rights, but many of them also are afraid to exercise their rights. And and also very often, even if they know that they are entitled to be paid, they don't know what they're entitled to be paid. It's not unusual to have someone come to me and say, the 3 or 4 of us that work in this restaurant, we work in the kitchen and we work 70 hours a week, and we're not getting paid minimum wage. I say, well, what about overtime? Do you get paid overtime? No, they don't know what overtime is. The idea that they might be working 30 hours a week for which they're supposed to be paid time and a half, that's not even in the equation for them. They're just looking to get paid what the boss promised to pay them. And it's sometimes an enlightening experience for both sides to suddenly find out that actually an enormous amount of money is owed to this worker because you've chosen to employ them and to ignore the law.
Now, one interesting point you brought up is, the relationship between what federal agencies do and what the responsibilities are locally. Immigrants has been a big issue in New London right now for the past maybe month. And we'll talk more about that later, but one person who spoke last week said, we really don't want a situation where if someone doesn't pay their income taxes or doesn't fill out their forms correctly, that we have local police officers arresting them on behalf of the IRS.
Right, exactly.
And her point was, so what's the difference? We don't want our local law enforcement officers doing the work of ICE any more than we want them to be doing the work of the IRS.
And it's interesting that among other bodies, is a national organization of chiefs of police that adopted a policy a number of years ago and said best practices for municipal police departments was that the officers would not question people about their immigration status. And it was for a very simple reason. If you're undocumented, or you have a family member who's undocumented, or someone who lives in your building is undocumented, you have a friend, you know that if the police are cooperating with ICE, that means that if you report a crime, there's a possibility that you or your neighbor or your friend or your family member may end up getting deported or detained. And sort of think about the mental process involved in that. I had a colleague, an immigration lawyer, a number of years ago who told me an incredible story about a man who reported a murder to the police. His best friend was assaulted and beaten up and killed on the street. And he witnessed it, and he went to the police and he reported it. And the police investigated the crime, but they also questioned him about his immigration status, as a result of which he not only ended up being deported, but while he was deported, he lost his family. His wife left him. She was a U.S. citizen. He had lost touch with his children. It took him some 10 years before he was finally able to be readmitted to the United States. And by that time, he had lost everything that he'd had here. So
the next person seeing this, they can witness a murder, and that murder is just not going to be solved. Absolutely. And maybe even more disturbing, that this is one of the things that there's been a lot of discussion about when it comes to this problem, is people who are women who are victims of domestic violence. I mean, you just think about it. Okay, you're married to a citizen and you're not a citizen, and he beats you up, and you call the police, and the first thing the police want to know isn't, do you need to go to the hospital? The first thing they want to know is, are you a U.S. citizen? Where are your papers? Where's your green card? Under that set of circumstances, just like the employer who has so much more power over the employee because of our immigration policies, in the same way that abuser, that abusive husband, or someone who's committing a crime against you, is that much more arrogant because they believe that the system will only work against you and will therefore prevent you from taking any action to get justice. And I think that's sort of a chronic problem we're facing in this country right now anyway, that there are people who feel like the law is going to work in their favor, and then there are people who know from experience that it will likely not work in their favor. Yeah, that's certainly true. There's been a lot of discussion in recent weeks, and I don't know if folks in your audience have been aware of this discussion, but literally there's been a discussion about why it is, if you're a white person, you should think twice about whether you ever call the police on a black person, because you know what? Maybe that person broke into your car. Maybe you saw them do something bad. The question you have to ask yourself is that a crime that somebody should be murdered for? Because there's a very strong possibility that if you call the police, and you're going to have to live with this possibility, right? That if you decide to call the police because you saw somebody do something that you thought was wrong, kid stole a candy bar from a grocery store, you're going to have to live with the possibility that the police may arrive and that kid may end up dead. And it's a pretty scary thing when, for a major sector of the population of the United States, the possibility that the government would become involved, the possibility that law enforcement would become involved in their lives, is something that terrifies them. Well, so one of the, in addition to wage theft and other unfair labor practices, you defend people who exercise their free speech rights.
That's true, I do.
In the community and in the workplace. Is there a discrepancy? I mean, do you end up defending one group of people more than another, or is it still mostly immigrants or working class people or?
Well, frankly, when it comes to our civil rights, I think we kind of have to acknowledge that's a pool that's getting smaller all the time. They're draining it, and so there are a lot of folks who want to be able to exercise their right to free speech and are finding increasingly that that the government will not allow them to do it, I'm frankly astonished sometimes to see it. I've had conversations with police officers who simply insisted that you don't have the right to walk up and down on the sidewalk. I'm thinking to myself, well, has this person ever seen a picket line? Have they ever been to a place where there was a union that was on strike? To actually say to me, to my face, no, you don't have the right to walk up and down on a sidewalk in front of a place of business holding a sign, unless you have a permit. No, we have a permit. It's called the Constitution.
Well, I think that I'm actually interested in city planning and how the organization of cities evolves, and it seems as though we are losing the commons, which is where we have these rights, and in cities, in public squares, on the sidewalks, those are the commons. I think when things became suburbanized in this country and people started meeting in the malls, which are private property, as opposed to in the commons, which is public property, we started losing some of those civil rights and not even knowing it.
Yeah, well, in the state of Connecticut, the Connecticut Supreme Court was presented with that question about the commons, whether or not shopping malls were the new commons. And I'm terrible on dates and case names. I'm supposed to know these things, but I would say it probably was in maybe the mid to late 1970s. And at that time, the argument was being presented that the shopping malls were the new commons, and therefore, even though they were private property, they had to be made, or some portion of them had to be made accessible to the public, because it was the only place in some communities where people could actually engage in First Amendment speech. And of course, the Connecticut Supreme Court at that time declined to find that. And it makes me wonder whether they would think differently about it today, because now most of us live in communities where there is very little public space and very little space in which we are allowed to express our opinions without access to a television station, for example.
Right. And yeah, I think that's true. I don't know how, I think maybe things might be going back the other direction. I certainly hope so. I think some cities like New Haven, where you were today, in New London, we have the plaza near the Soldiers and Sailors Monument, which has for years, decades, been considered a free speech zone. But, you just go a town or two over and I don't know what East Lyme has, or
I get calls from people. It's not unusual. I get calls from people asking me things like, 3 of us had signs about some, it doesn't matter what it was about. 3 of us had signs, and we went down to our town green, and we stood on the sidewalk outside the town green, and the police came along and said that we were loitering and that we weren't allowed to be there. Don't we have the right to engage in First Amendment protected speech? I say, absolutely you do. Absolutely you do. And here's the hard part. Unless it's something that's built into city planning, like as you've mentioned, and that certainly is true in some places, unless that's the case, the only way that that situation is going to change, if those people go back and insist on doing it again, until finally the city has, or the town asks its lawyer, and the lawyer says, of course you have to allow them to stand there. Of course they can carry signs. Because it's common knowledge, but it's common knowledge. It's a right that we get. It's a right that we can protect only by enforcing it against the government.
Now, I know you do workplace law, and other than like having the right to get your own wages, what other rights do people have in the workplace that might be threatened at times?
Well, it's interesting because one of the things about the state of Connecticut that's a little bit different than many other states, we actually have a state law that says that private employers cannot fire employees or discriminate against employees for exercising rights that would be protected by the First Amendment. Ordinarily, a private employer can do anything they want when it comes to an employee's political opinions or speech or whatever. But the Connecticut legislature very wisely said, no, you know what? If this is speech that would be protected by the First Amendment, then it's protected from action by an employer, even if they're a private employer. I think you probably remember not that long ago our president declaring that the female reporter from ESPN, that she ought to be fired from her job because of things that she had said. Well, as a matter of fact, if that had happened, I mean, that was in Connecticut. And one of the reasons that ESPN ran for cover and didn't embrace the president's idea is that they're not stupid. They've done business in Connecticut for a long time, and they know it would be against the law in our state for even a private employer to retaliate against someone for their free speech, even if it was at the request of the President of the United States.
So there are some really good reasons to live in Connecticut.
There you go. That's one of them.
Who knew? New London, it's been kind of controversial. There's a group that within the last month or so has asked City Council to create a resolution that reinforce some of the best practices that the police have adopted in their own police practices of not asking immigration status. But it's proved really pretty controversial for something that in theory is already happening. What is the best way for Connecticut as a state or individual towns to protect rights, statutorily, I guess, in light of what the national climate is right now?
Well, I think that it does send a very, very important statement when people say we want to have an ordinance that places immigration status or perceived immigration status as a protected class in the same category as race and sex and national origin and gender expression, because that's essentially saying to people in the community, as far as we're concerned, we're not involved in the business of enforcing immigration law and deciding who deserves to be here and who does not deserve to be here. As far as we're concerned, everyone in our community belongs here. Everyone in our community is entitled to the same protections of the law. And I think it's important, especially in this environment, to go out of your way for our communities and for our community organizations to go out of our way to convey that message to people. The town that I live in, West Hartford, we have a town human rights commission, and that's not unusual. There are a number of towns that have human rights commissions or some similar body, and one of the functions that they can serve is to look at the town and ask themselves the question: if I were a member of this group, would I feel welcome in this town? That can be true for not just for people who are undocumented. It can be true for religious minorities, racial minorities. There are lots of folks who right now seem intent on only allowing people who are like them to live in their communities. And if there was anything that was more un-American than that, I just don't know what it would be.
Now, I've heard people worried that the federal government will retaliate against towns that do that. Is that a credible fear?
Well, it's like the question that lawyers get asked all the time. They say, someone will say to me, well, can you sue for that? And I say, well, yeah, because you can sue for anything. You go in and you pay your your fee to file a complaint. Of course you can sue for that. That doesn't mean that you're going to win or be successful. So when we're talking about this issue of federal immigration law and sanctuary cities, in spite of all the bluster coming from the White House since Trump got elected, the plain fact of the matter is no city has been penalized for being a sanctuary city. And there's a very good reason for that, because that's not what the law was intended to do. When they passed a law that said that being complicit in breaking immigration laws was a crime, they weren't talking about sanctuary cities. They were talking about things like human trafficking. So the notion that a city that wants to protect its residents and ensure that all of them feel welcome and that all of them feel that they have access to the police, to public services, to the schools. The idea that that should be punished is absurd, and the idea that there is a law in place that does that is absurd. And I'm just not aware of any constitutional scholar whose opinion I could respect who would say, "Oh yeah, that's what that law means."
And I'm guessing as a result, it is unlikely for the federal government to even pursue that. It would cost money for them to do it, and it would probably get a lot of publicity that was a lot of it not good.
Yeah, and one thing that's interesting about people in Connecticut, I see this a lot actually, I see this in my town, is that we have this peculiar idea that we're at the center of the universe. So it doesn't occur to them that, well, if this was going to be tested, maybe the government would go after Los Angeles or New York or Chicago or Portland, Oregon, or Seattle, Washington, San Francisco, Ann Arbor, Michigan, any number of other cities that have declared themselves to be sanctuary cities, the hundreds that have declared themselves to be sanctuary cities. They might be further in line as far as
London, Connecticut might be way
we're just
down.
not. I'm sorry, we're just not. So there's that element of it. There's just a very practical aspect of it. But there is also, I think, something really dangerous in the threat. And it's something I've talked with people about quite a bit over the years, and it doesn't just have to do with immigration. It's something that also comes up in I think a number of other areas involving our civil rights and civil liberties, which is this notion that politicians, many of whom, and sad to say, most of whom are lawyers, and I don't think that's a healthy thing, but nonetheless, that's the plain fact of the matter. That's where we are. But politicians who know better will engage in these blustery campaigns that when they get elected into office, they're going to do X, Y, and Z, or for that matter, try to propose or pass bills that do X, Y, and Z, even though they know those things would be illegal. Here, we hear that when people talk about sanctuary cities. A couple of years ago, the state of Kansas passed a state referendum that forbade the use of Sharia law, Muslim law, in the state court system. Now, we don't have time to go into it here, but there's a dozen reasons why you wouldn't actually want that to be law. And at the top of the list would be the fact that it's a violation of the Constitution. And the people who promoted it, the Attorney General who promoted that, he knew it. He knew that it was unconstitutional. He knew that it would be deemed illegal by the courts. And he knew that the day that he proposed it. He knew every time he gave a speech about it, every time he was quoted in the newspaper, every time he went on television. From beginning to end, he knew that what he was proposing was blatantly unconstitutional in a way that even a first-year law student could tell you. And yet he continued to propose it anyway. And to me, that's one of the most dangerous things I've seen in recent years, are these campaigns by politicians, conservative politicians for the most part, not exclusively, but for the most part conservative politicians, who simply don't care that they know that the things they're doing would not pass constitutional muster, because it's way too useful for them. It's way too useful a tool to be able to, frankly, deceive their base into believing that a certain thing could be constitutionally approved by, could be approved by the courts.
Now, one more thing that I had seen in the news, for the 2020 census, the federal government is proposing adding citizen status is one of the questions that's being asked. Is this going to happen? And can it be stopped if that's the plan?
It's a good question whether it can be stopped. Certainly, there's an active campaign to get injunctions to prevent it from happening. I think that, frankly, that's quite possible because the implications are really pretty scary. I think that for folks who live in communities where there are relatively few, or at least where they believe that there are relatively few people who are undocumented, it might be difficult to appreciate. But I don't think that you can really underestimate the amount of fear that's spread through communities when government officials begin going around and asking people questions that could lead to friends or family members or neighbors being rounded up and taken away. Sad to say, apparently most of us aren't even offended by the idea of the United States government going into neighborhoods, asking questions, rounding up people and putting them in detention camps, something that, in our past history, we only know from the Japanese internment
Right.
camps.
History has not judged kindly.
Yes. Sad to say, we're not even terribly offended by that most of the time. But at the very least, we ought to be able to look at the situation and say, what would it feel like if you lived in that community? What would it feel like for people to be afraid to go out to the store or to take their kid to school because of the possibility that, first of all, the possibility that they would be detained by ICE and taken away, separated from their family, and kept in jail or deported. But even if the federal government were sending people door to door to question people about their immigration status, imagine how frightening it would be to feel that because of the United States government, you were afraid to answer your own door.
And I'm thinking if you had people not answering the door, and we have communities that have a high immigrant population, the results of the census is that we get loss of representation because our population would be understated.
Sure. Population isn't a matter of how many people are going to vote. It's a matter of how many people live in a community, because that's what determines what resources they need. That's what determines how you plan, how you make decisions about school enrollment or building new schools. This is something that is a completely dysfunctional proposal. It's arguably unconstitutional. It's terrifying for the people who are subject to it. It says something really deplorable about the state of civil liberties in the United States. And on top of that, it actually is a bad practice. It doesn't do what census taking is supposed to do.
And I've seen like some historical census looking at my grandparents, and I just can't imagine. I don't even know what my grandparents' immigration status is. There's no way of telling. It does have nation of origin information, but I don't know if they became citizens, when they became citizens. I was a couple generations down the pipe, and so when people say, oh, my grandparents came legally, I think a lot of us really don't know how our grandparents got here and got to stay here.
Well, that's absolutely true. I know people in my family, in family, extended family of relatives, just who have casually mentioned, told family stories that strongly indicated that family members were not in the country lawfully. And actually, this was really common. Folks are very proud to declaim that they came here legally. The laws were a lot different then, but the plain fact of the matter is that even then, there were plenty of folks coming in who were breaking the law, and many of their descendants are the ones with the biggest mouths right now about how you have to be, you have to go through the right process and be a citizen before you can be allowed in.
Yeah, you climb in and then you pull up the ladder for everyone
Right,
else.
exactly.
Now, you are seeking the nomination to run for Connecticut Attorney General. So I thought I'd ask you, what does the Attorney General do in Connecticut? What are his or her responsibilities?
Well, one of the most important things to understand about the Connecticut Attorney General is that, unlike in many states, we have an Attorney General who is an elected civil authority, and that person does not have jurisdiction over criminal matters. The state's attorney is the one who, in fact, it's kind of interesting to note that while the person involved with enforcement of civil law, civil state law, is an elected official, the person who's responsible for the enforcement of criminal law is not.
Now, who appointed by the governor?
Appointed by the governor. So that's a place we kind of have to start. One of the reasons I mention it is that, incidentally, there's a campaign going on, and I think if you know the journalist Sean King, who's written really, really great stuff over the years about problems of race in America and Black Lives Matter, he is working on a campaign now to try to get attorney generals elected into, and district attorneys elected in various places around the country, in circumstances where they enforce criminal laws, because the plain fact of the matter is that these are the people who have a really terrible track record right now of saying, well, whether or not you get charged with a crime depends on the color of your skin, the neighborhood that you were in, things that should have nothing at all to do with a system that supposedly resembles justice. And they are responsible for some really heinous decisions, absolving police officers from criminal responsibility for really, really horrendous crimes. So I mentioned that as a side. It doesn't really have anything to do with the state of Connecticut, but it's just an interesting thing that in Connecticut, our Attorney General doesn't have that responsibility. What our Attorney General does have responsibility for is enforcing Connecticut laws to promote the best interests of the people of the state. And among other things, that means that it's the Attorney General's office who ultimately has responsibility for adjudicating claims for unpaid wages, claims for unemployment benefits, claims for violations of civil rights laws, anti-discrimination laws, that sort of thing. The Connecticut Attorney General is kind of the lawyer of last resort. And of course, that means that office sets priorities and says, here are the areas where we want to focus our energy. Now, in past years, the Connecticut Attorney General's energy to a large extent, has been focused on very high-profile issues and things like, class action litigation. And you know what? Class action litigation for consumers, it's very important. For environmental protection, is very important. But those are not the only areas that the Connecticut Attorney General has jurisdiction over. And one of the things that made me decide that I wanted to run for Attorney General was that I wanted to create a platform in which we talk about some of the things that an Attorney General has the power to do under Connecticut law, and yet we have not even begun to have a discussion about, well, why don't we do that?
Okay, so what kind of issues are those? I don't know. Give us an idea of the beginnings of the forming platform.
So, one is really an issue that we have already talked about, and it is true that the Connecticut Attorney General, his office, does have the ability to enforce wage and hour law, and they do. Civil liability, wage and hour law. But in the state of New York, the Attorney General's office not only has that jurisdiction, but the way they've exercised it is to assemble essentially a coalition of community organizations and faith-based organizations and legal service organizations. And those organizations serve as the eyes and ears of the Attorney General's office. They're the ones who bring to his attention the fact that there's a problem in a particular industry or in a particular workplace. And the New York Attorney General very vigorously enforces those wage and hour laws and goes after those employers, to the fullest extent that the law allows. Here in Connecticut, we have some pretty good laws on the books as far as wage and hour issues go, but the plain fact of the matter is we're not enforcing them. And to me, one of the most important things an Attorney General could do would be to draw attention to the fact that millions of dollars in wages every year are being stolen from hardworking people, and that a vigorous campaign to enforce wage and hour laws would benefit every working person by ensuring that no employer believes they can get off easy by cheating their employees.
So yeah, that sounds like number one in terms of affecting a whole lot of people. But I don't think I've ever heard that a Connecticut Attorney General talk about it.
Right. It's not a priority. Exactly. The litigation involving the people who, the example I always like to use is you remember how you used to get the solicitations in the mail to join a record club?
Oh, yeah.
And you'd join and then you'd end up owing them hundreds of dollars because you didn't send back the CDs or the albums fast enough. That's a consumer rights issue. And it's a good consumer rights issue. It's important. But the plain fact of the matter is, it's not the issue that the Connecticut Attorney General should be focusing on. Problems like wage theft, that has a really direct impact on an awful lot of people, and it's something we have laws on the books about, and it's something we can do.
Now, there are a lot of just general, when I was thinking of like Green Party kinds of issues, and I was wondering what attorney generals can do to help if they can do anything to promote it. Healthcare issues. I know a lot of people have problems with insurance companies, and coverage is so disorganized, and of course, in many cases, corporate ruled and complicated. Is there anything in the Attorney General role that could help the situation, or would we have to legislate a different system?
Well, I think that it would be a great idea for the Connecticut Attorney General, if they're going to, if we're going to be talking about class action lawsuits, to start with the insurance companies. I don't think it's just me. I went to college. I got a degree. I went to law school. I've been practicing law for over 20 years. And we've recently, in our family, we recently had medical claims. I've had to call up the service person and ask them to explain to me why this claim isn't being covered. And I literally have spent, the last time this happened, I spent 2 days on the telephone.
You're not getting
nonstop.
paid for those hours.
Oh, those are my personal hours. I spent 2 days on the telephone trying to get these claims paid for. And every time I do this, the thing that sticks out to me the most is that, as upset as it makes me, as crazy as it makes me, how much worse is it for someone with a high school education, or who doesn't have a higher education, hasn't had to read complex legal documents, and has to try to demonstrate to the insurance company that they, under the policy that they issued, they're entitled to have these things covered.
And they might not have 2 days to spare either.
Right, well, of course. No, nobody really does. This was an exceptional set of circumstances, and it was so important that I felt I had to do it. And ultimately, thank goodness I did, because it saved us literally thousands and thousands of dollars. But I had to spend 2 days in order to do that. And, you're right. People don't have the time. They don't have the energy. They don't have the knowledge. And frankly, when I look at insurance company profits, health insurance company profits, I have to suppose, just based on my experience, I have to suppose that these companies are making millions and millions of dollars every year in profits that they are not entitled to, because they are not paying claims to people in violation of their own policies. So yeah, I'd love to. I think that would be something that the Attorney General's office could take a really serious look at. Now, we're in the insurance capital of the world. We still call ourselves
Right.
that. So it's kind of an interesting problem here. What kind of political pressures would be brought to bear? But that's one of the reasons why you've never heard the Connecticut Attorney General say that they want to do that.
Although it does seem as though the Connecticut Attorney General might be in a better position to say that than trying to get legislation, different legislation passed. passed or
Well-
stronger legislation
Well,
passed.
but you know, it's not even. And you're right. You're right. But when I started thinking about the idea of running for Attorney General, one of the things that I sort of wanted to take as a starting point is that maybe there are problems for which it's not that we haven't figured out how to fix them, it's that we're not willing to enforce the fix. So, you know, the wage and hour laws are a great example of that, right? We've had them for decades. We've had the federal law since 1937. But it's a failure of enforcement. In this area too, there's no policy, there's no law that permits an insurance company to say in writing that they're going to cover something and then refuse to do it and make it impossible for you to obtain your rights. That's not lawful. We don't have to change the law in order to do that. What we have to do is enforce the law.
Now, we only have 5 minutes left, and I just had a question. This is just sort of a pet issue with me. How do you feel about drug testing in the workplace? And it seems like more and more workplaces do it, and personally, I hate it. I have my own reasons for not thinking it's very useful, but is there anything that could be changed, imposed on workplaces?
This is an issue that we're going to have to confront pretty soon. You know, as we get closer and closer to legalization of marijuana and already have medical marijuana available to people in the state of Connecticut, at some point, the federal laws that currently permit employers to engage in this kind of testing and the state program that allows somebody to consume marijuana, not on the job, but obviously they have it
Right.
in their bloodstream, right? It's a collision. We're on a collision course, and we're going to have to address it. There recently was a labor arbitration decision in which an arbitrator reinstated an employee to work where they had been fired because they tested positive for marijuana, when the employer knew that they had a certificate from the state to use medical marijuana. And you know, it was the first shot across the bow. It's something that, you know, we're going to have to take up in a really serious way. And incidentally, it's one of those things, along with things like gene testing and lifestyle questionnaires,
Yeah.
that simply shouldn't be part of the workplace. The employer doesn't have any right to run your personal life.
Yeah, it seems very intrusive. And my own experience was that when I worked for Head Start, at one point I lost a very good bus driver because he had a Monday morning positive test for cannabis. And he never was impaired on the job. And we subsequently got another driver who was on prescription legal medications that actually did impair his performance. And I started to think, well, drug tests, in addition to being very intrusive, they actually don't test what we need them to.
It's in that category, along with things like, you know, requiring police to question people about their immigration status. It's in that category of things that politicians propose to people with the idea that it will help them to feel safer, even though the politicians themselves know it won't have that effect and that it will actually make things worse.
Well, I think we're out of time, Peter. Thank you for coming down to New London.
Well, thank
we
you.
will hear more from you, I imagine, maybe in fall as things heat up. And just, I want to let everyone out there know this Saturday, New London Landmarks is sponsoring 3 Jane's Walks for Jane Jacobs' birthday, a tree walk in the morning in downtown New London. I'm leading one on Broad Street about economic development, and then there will be one tour in Town Hill, and I recommend it. Should be interesting. So thanks again, Peter, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Africa, ningpenda mzuri sana. Tuimbe Afrika, tuimbe Afrika, tuimbe Afrika yo, nimpenda mzuri sana.
Tuimbe Afrika, tuimbe Afrika, tuimbe Afrika, ninakupenda sana.
Oh, tuimbe Afrika yo, tuimbe Afrika, piga ngoma yako mama, tusale muziki mingi.
Tuimbe Afrika, tuimbe Afrika, tuimbe Afrika, ninakupenda sana.
Oh, tucheze muziki sana, piga makofi wewe, baba na ngoma yetu wewe, bote ndani kubanga.
Tuimbe Afrika, tuimbe Afrika, tuimbe Afrika, ninakupenda sana.
Oh, Zana Africa, Zana Africa, Zana Africa, we know Africa, yo.
Tuimbe Afrika, tuimbe Afrika, tuimbe Afrika, ninakupenda sana.
Oh, mwimbe Africa, mwimbe Africa, mwimbe Africa, yo. Mpenda mzuri sana.
Tuimbe Afrika,
Oh,
tuimbe
Africa,
tuimbe
Africa, mzuri sana. Tucheze muziki mama, yako Uganda na kupenda, napiga mzuri wewe East Africa. Oh yeah mama, Africa, Africa. Oh, nakupenda wewe na jini mama, tutaona makidogo, anapiga wewe nzuri sana sa kidogo. Oh, wimbo Afrika, wimbe Afrika, wimbo Afrika, yo, nimpenda mzuri sana.
Tuimbe Afrika, tuimbe Afrika, tuimbe Afrika, ninakupenda sana.
Jambo Afrika, jambo Afrika, jambo Afrika, wimbe Afrika.
Tuimbe Afrika, tuimbe Afrika, tuimbe Afrika, ninakupenda sana.
Oh, ni mkubwa muziki wange,